So again, thank you very much for the invitation, Bernhard. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. And Bernhard asked me to present a new paper that I'm a lead author on, although it's a paper co-authored by more than 25 scientists from across Europe. And I should mention Dr. Reka Asalos in particular. She's the lead, I'm the senior. And Dr. Asalos is at the Hungarian Institute for Ecology and Botany outside of Budapest. The paper I'm presenting this morning is called Natural Disturbances as a Guide for Silviculture in Europe. And I'll be focusing in particular on a proposal we have for something called a comparability index. Now, I will explain this in great detail a little bit later in the talk, but I thought I would begin with the context and a little bit of the background on how this idea developed and maybe sort of where it sits within the broader context of sustainable forest management in Europe. So that's what I will attempt to do with my time today. So we begin with a fundamental question that I think scientists and forest managers are wrestling with around the world, which is, what can we learn from natural systems? What can we learn from natural forest dynamics, natural processes of forest stand development, and from natural disturbance regimes? And can we learn lessons from those that would help inform the way we do sustainable forest management, both in what Americans call working forests or managed forests, as well as various different types of protected forests? And are there lessons that can be shared from our experiences, both in North America and Europe and elsewhere in the world? So we'll be drawing on a variety of lessons this morning as we explore this question. And I'll try to cover two key points as I contextualize this study, this paper. The first is placing it within the context of previous work mapping the distribution of primary forests in Europe, and then also performing a gap analysis on those in order to understand both how well those are protected and also where opportunities for additional protection and perhaps even restoration reside. And then we'll talk specifically about the silviculture. So what types of silvicultural systems would we use to restore complex older forest conditions where those are desirable? Now, this is just one framing of this, just one lens to look at this. I probably could have presented this paper in a variety of different frameworks. We could have approached it from a biodiversity standpoint. We could have approached it from a forest hydrology standpoint, or perhaps a carbon management standpoint. But in this particular talk, I'm going to frame it this way in the context of primary forest, just as, again, one way to contextualize it. So we'll start with that question. So we have a good understanding where and how much primary forest remains in Europe. Of course, there's still work to be done, and I know that this group is familiar with that. But I'll quickly highlight a couple of the papers that support that conclusion. I've had the pleasure of being involved with these. We've had a series of papers in the journal Diversity and Distributions. These are led by Dr. Francesco Sabatini and Tobias Cumarelli at Humboldt University of Berlin, Germany. In the first paper, we assembled all of the known data sets, or at least all of the data sets that we could put our hands on from across Europe. These are data sets describing the characteristics of primary forests. And by primary, in this context, I mean highly natural forests that have never been cleared, or at least have a limited history of human disturbance within documented history. And from this data set, compiling all known spatial locations of primary forests in Europe, we then conducted a modeling exercise using various different bootstrapping and regression techniques to then predict the likely occurrence of additional primary forests that perhaps has not been entirely mapped. And in this exercise, we came to the prediction that there may be as much as 1.5 or 1.4 million hectares of primary forests, at least in the 32 countries that we assessed. If we add primary forests in Russia, that number triples or even quadruples. So excluding Russia from this analysis, we still find a significant amount of primary forest, perhaps more than was previously acknowledged. And yet, while 89% of that has some degree of protection, only 46% is strictly protected. In the next paper, also in diversity and distributions, again led by Dr. Sabatini, we went one step further and we performed a gap analysis on that distribution of primary forests. So here you see primary forests ranked across Europe within administrative units. So these are somewhat odd geopolitical boundaries that differ somewhat among countries. And you see it ranked in terms of its degree of protection, places where protection can be upgraded or enhanced. So for example, where primary forests are within protected areas, but remain poorly protected within those. And also significantly for this talk, areas where there are significant restoration opportunities. What that means, these restoration gaps, these are places where primary forests are poorly represented, where we have very little of the 54 forest types that we assessed remaining, or where remaining fragments of primary forests are highly isolated and would benefit from restoration activities that could reestablish larger, more contiguous areas of primary forest, and again, enhance, in particular, underrepresented old forest habitats. So from this analysis, we concluded that there are significant opportunities for restoration in this particular context. And even considering the remaining primary forests, it would only take a modest 1% expansion of the protected areas network in Europe, representing only 0.3% of Europe's land area, to fully protect all remaining primary forests. Okay, but we are left with this question then. How would we restore complex older forest structures for this particular objective using this lens of analysis? Can we restore old forests by emulating natural disturbance regimes? Do natural processes of forest development provide a guide for silviculture? And then the challenge in Europe, I would argue, or maybe propose rather provocatively, is do we have the silvicultural systems that we need here in Europe for that objective? Or do we perhaps need something entirely different? Or perhaps do we need to consider modifying some of our existing silvicultural approaches, like continuous cover forestry, like the Dauerwald, like pro-silva or close to nature silviculture? So we need to consider, how would we do this? How would we restore complex older forest functions and characteristics? So this brings us to key point number 2, substantial opportunities for restoration of complex and late seral forest characteristics. And it's going to require an understanding of forest dynamics, of course, within the context of global change and altered disturbance regimes and land use history and all of these things that are so important here. Okay, so we're getting closer then to the actual paper, although I'm still setting it up here, I'm contextualizing it. Okay, so how can we learn from natural forests and natural forest dynamics, and how could we develop silvicultural approaches that would emulate those? Well, in North America, we decided that we needed to throw the classic silviculture textbook out the window, so to speak, and start from scratch and develop new approaches that were entirely aimed at encouraging forests to develop towards that structurally complex late successional condition and to accelerate their rates of development. I myself have been involved in this for many years. There are many examples of this from all over North America. This is just one, but in my experiment, we spent many years studying the dynamics of old forests as reference points. We developed a whole variety of silvicultural techniques, each of which was designed to emulate a different process of forest development, such as different types of mortality processes that thin a forest over time or create gaps and allow larger trees to develop. So we used all of these silvicultural approaches together as a package. And then 20 years later, we're able to measure the outcomes. And we've been very pleased with the success of this approach. And we've compared it alongside some of the more conventional selection harvesting systems like single tree selection and group selection that would be more similar to your close to nature silviculture in Europe, in order to understand the benefits of an entirely new approach like this. Okay, I would argue that there's interest in similar approaches in Europe. Certainly you have a long history with close to nature silviculture and various different selection harvesting systems here. I know that many people on the call are intimately familiar with these. I've toured many of the demonstration sites in Central Europe in particular, like this one in Bohemia, and I have a solid understanding of these systems. But I think I and many would say that while the European close to nature silviculture does a good job at emulating some aspects of natural disturbance regimes, like gap processes, like natural regeneration, and can be highly useful for conversion, let's say, of non-endemic spruce plantations to native endemic mixed species compositions, and are maybe highly useful for developing complex vertical structures. As practiced currently in Europe, these systems often underrepresent other elements of structural complexity associated with disturbances, such as large legacy trees, standing dead trees, down logs, tip-up mounds, spatial complexity and gap mosaics, and a variety of other things. And so now there's interest, of course, in perhaps adapting these systems even further to bring in some of these missing elements. I've been very excited to read your current report, or the report that the European Forest Institute sponsored, Closer to Nature Forest Management, that incorporates some of these same ideas. So again, I see the field in Europe moving in this direction as well. But with the paper I'm about to present in a couple of minutes, I'm hoping to provide a bit of a quantitative guide that will help inform the actual practice of closer to nature forest management as proposed in your report. So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so the elements then that would need to go into a quantitative guide include this kind of thing. This is a conceptual model that was proposed in North America. I'm sorry to keep referring back there. Bernhard asked me specifically not to use too many North American examples this morning, but being from there, I just can't seem to avoid it. This is the three legs stool of natural disturbance-based forestry or natural dynamic silviculture. And it very simply thinks about the characteristics of natural disturbances that we might want to emulate in our silviculture. So for example, incorporating biological legacies, which you could also call residual structure or a carryover of structure into our managed forests. So that would include large living trees, large dead trees, large down logs, and other kinds of things like biota in the soil system and a variety of other biological legacies. Incorporating natural stand development processes including small scale disturbances into intermediate treatments, which means thinning. So for example, rather than thinning forests at a uniform density, as perhaps conventional forestry would have done, mixing things up using variable density thinning to create more complexity in spatial patterns within forests, the same way that natural disturbances do. And then the third leg is allowing appropriate recovery periods, which essentially means employing extended rotations that provide time to allow late sterile or old forest conditions to develop. Okay, so those are the three things that we have to accomplish with natural dynamic silviculture. This idea of an index or a quantitative guide for all of this had been previously proposed. It was proposed by Robert Seymour and some of his colleagues at the University of Maine a long time ago in the early 2000s. And they reviewed all of the information on natural disturbances in the northeastern US going way back to the early 1600s. And they conceptualized this on the figure that you're seeing here, where you could plot all natural disturbances in our region on these two axes, their spatial area or the size of the disturbances and their frequency. So how often do they occur? And in this particular example, in this paper, they concluded that we had these two main types of disturbances, those that occur very, very infrequently, but affect large areas, and those that occur more frequently and affect smaller areas. And there was an interesting quantitative relationship between these two that we can call the comparability index. So for example, if we start plotting the position in this ordination space of typical silvicultural systems like clear cutting or group selection, we can see how well these silvicultural approaches align with the natural scales and frequencies. And essentially their distance in ordination space in this quantitative conceptualization from the natural scales and frequencies, we can call the comparability index. It's the line that you're seeing right here. But we were missing something. We were missing the space in between these types of disturbances, the high frequency and the low frequency. And that is the moderate frequency disturbances, the partial disturbances, the moderate intensity disturbances that forest scientists have learned a lot more about in recent years, both in Europe and in North America. Either we weren't looking for these things in the past and they were ignored by the literature, that's one hypothesis, or these types of disturbances are occurring more frequently now with global change. So for example, phenomena like microbursts, straight line winds, tornadoes, ice storms, more localized or partial mortality insect and pathogen outbreaks. These are now recognized as a very, very important influencing factor on forest landscapes. And we see this throughout the Carpathians. We also see it in my region of the US. So in one of my papers, we then added these intermediate intensity disturbances to the comparability index. And this has been highly informative for silviculture because we can learn a lot about these intermediate intensity disturbances that can guide silviculture. So for example, many of the irregular shelterwood harvesting systems that silviculturalists throughout temperate regions of the world are interested in now very closely emulate these intermediate disturbances. So disturbances that create large gaps or intermediately sized openings, but have a high degree of carryover of legacy structure, residual trees. So this is one example. It's called expanding gap, or the irregular shelterwood expanding gap system that's used now in my region of the world. But here in Europe, there's also experimentation with this type of silviculture. So irregularly shaped gaps, variable sizes with permanent retention of legacy trees within these gaps. Again, emulating these intermediate intensity disturbances. Okay, so we're getting close now. We're building this conceptual model. We now have a model that has two axes, and we've recognized the role of intermediate intensity disturbances. Okay, now finally, that brings us to Europe and to the recent paper. So this paper that I'd like to use the remainder of my time to talk about was published just this month in the journal Ecological Applications. And again, it was a team effort involving all of these scientists that you're seeing here. And in this paper, we wanted to adapt the comparability index that had been developed for North America to Europe. We wanted to see if we could make it work here. And we wanted to populate it with real data. So we went about assembling data on both natural disturbance regimes, the attributes of disturbances, as well as the the attributes of silviculture across Europe as currently employed in 4 major forest types. So oak systems, spruce systems, beech systems, and Scots pine. We were able to assemble data on those 2 things from these 13 countries that you're seeing right here. Next, we wanted to understand the different types of silvicultural systems that are used in these 4 major forest types. And we wanted to understand the attributes of interest, such as the spatial area that they are typically applied to, the degree of retention or residual structure that these systems employ, and of course, the frequency with which they're used, their rotations or their entry cycles. And we did that for these systems that you're seeing here: shelter wood, clear cutting, uneven age management, coppice systems, etc. And this was actually no small undertaking. It was very, very challenging to standardize the definitions for these silvicultural systems across these countries. We found that each country employed these systems in slightly different ways and had slightly different definitions for each of these. So a big part of the effort was simply trying to standardize how we quantified and defined these systems. Once we did that, however, we were able to quantify the attributes of interest for all of those. And so one of the things you're seeing here is that we've added an additional attribute of interest to the comparability index. Whereas the North American version had only size or area and frequency, we wanted to add that 3rd leg of the natural dynamic silviculture stool, which is legacy structure or retention of trees, living and dead. Critical element of ecological silviculture and close to nature forestry. So we quantified the degree of retention as typically practiced in Europe for these major systems, as well as the other attributes. And of course, you're seeing a wide range of variability in how these are practiced across the 13 countries and among the 4 forest types. Once we'd gone through this whole exercise using a combination of literature-derived data as well as expert opinion, we were able to begin our conceptualization. So this takes some degree of explanation, so bear with me as I walk you through it. So what you're seeing here is a 3-dimensional conceptualization of the comparability index. And again, rather than just those 2 axes, we now have 3 axes. We have size or area, residual structure or legacy, and frequency. And these spheres, these are actually 3-dimensional spheres, represent both natural disturbances as well as silvicultural disturbances. So the bluer colors are the natural disturbances, the yellows and reds and oranges are silviculture. And you're seeing the 3-dimensional space that those occupy within these 3 axes. So now we can begin to think about, or at least ask the question, how closely do these silvicultural systems approximate the 3-dimensional space represented by natural disturbances? How close are they? And if we drew lines through this 3-dimensional space like this, we could actually calculate the comparability index. It's difficult to do that within a 3-dimensional or even an n-dimensional space, so we have to break it down this way using 2-dimensional spaces. Okay, so now we have those each possible combination of the axes plotted against each other. So frequency versus size, residual structure versus frequency, residual structure versus size, etc. And again, we're comparing natural disturbances with the silvicultural systems. The comparability index is simply a regression analysis comparing the centroids for each of these spheres. So now we're getting very close to being able to actually quantify these relationships. In the paper, we present them this way in a series of tables. And we now have a numeric basis for assessing, again, the similarity within this ordination space of silvicultural systems and natural disturbance effects. So we could look at this example and we could say, okay, uneven aged silviculture or selection harvesting systems, as commonly practiced in Europe, have a comparability index of 0.5, which is actually fairly similar to natural disturbances. Whereas other types of systems, as commonly practiced in Europe, have much lower comparability index. Their three-dimensional space is distant from that is occupied by natural disturbances. So for these, we might say, okay, there's substantial room for improvement in terms of harvesting frequency and the variability of sizes that we're harvesting, and of course, residual structure in particular, retention of legacy trees. So now we have some way of quantitatively thinking about these relationships. And then the conclusion was simply that natural disturbances, as you saw in those figures, are highly variable in size, frequency, and residual structure across Europe. But European forest management, as commonly practices, doesn't encompass that full complexity of sizes, frequencies, and structures. The comparability index showed high congruence or similarity between certain types of silviculture, like selection harvesting systems and natural disturbances. But even there, those types of systems, which by the way, include many of the closer to nature silviculture practices, emulate only a portion of the complexity that we see in natural disturbance effects. The remaining silvicultural systems performed poorly in terms of emulation, and we suggest that silviculture still has a lot of room for improvement in terms of expanding the range of practices that are used and encompassing a wider range of variability of structures that we create. So then these are my final slides then. Because we're left with the fundamental question of, how do we do that in Europe and where do we do that? Where would this larger portfolio of silvicultural practices that perhaps more closely emulate natural disturbances, where would those be appropriate? Where would they be valuable? Well, we suggest in the paper that they might be most appropriate in forests that are managed for a wide range of objectives. So not just timber, but also forests that are managed for biodiversity and conservation values and flood resilience, carbon and other objectives. They might be most appropriate to managed protected areas as well as sustainably managed forests outside of those areas. And then of course, in Europe, we have to think really, really carefully about how we would use approaches like this in the context of disturbance risks and increasing risks for things like bark beetles and fire and the interaction with drought. But I think the science is developing very rapidly in a way that will help inform the application of this idea. I was again very excited to see the other report that you sponsored, that the European Forest Institute sponsored, Living with Bark Beetles. This provides a great roadmap for thinking about where things like retention forestry or closer to nature silviculture could be used. For example, where bark beetle risks are lower, or where there's an explicit restoration objective to produce more diversified, more complex landscapes that would limit bark beetle spread, certainly in the context of drought and endemic versus outbreak, reproductive cycles in beetles. So we have a lot of good science now that I think can help inform the application of some of these natural dynamics concepts. And with that, I will thank you again for the invitation to speak with you this morning. And I'm sorry that went a little bit long, but I would welcome any questions that you might have.
Super, Bill. This was a splendid start into the morning. So it was interesting for me also to fresh up a bit, being so much in the policy cycle. So this was really inspiring again. And you're aware that, of course, currently we have a heated debate about the future use of our forests. And I think a major message is that we have to rely on science and not so much only on emotions or interest or something like this. And I think this is what we also want to encourage in this process, that it's a science-led process that brings the latest state of science also into the political domain. And this was also one of the reasons you just mentioned. This paper was just published last month. So I think this is also an indication that we want to really be at the pulse of time. And this was a great overview. So, dear participants, as Bill mentioned, so we have time for a couple of questions or comments. I think this was a very relevant thing, and also a little bit provocative, because asking us to throw our books out of the window. But we are here in a safe space, I would guess. But this is, but it's an interesting point. So basically, the issue is to be proactive and not just only react to what will be prescribed then afterwards. Hubertus, I see your hand.
I have a question just on your very last slide, where you showed the areas of different forest categories that you thought might be appropriate for your approach. Do you have any information on the relative sizes of those areas, which might guide where policy interventions might be having the quickest benefits?
So you mean the area in the various different IUCN protected areas category?
Yeah, and particularly in the certified production forest category.
Yes, so those statistics exist for sure, and I'm sure the World Conservation Monitoring Center and IUCN would have them. I don't personally have those at my disposal. We didn't include the numbers in the paper. That would be interesting. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have also some comments in the chat by Tomasz. Also, Bill, if
yes,
you have to decide this, whether we can have this presentation sort of made publicly available.
Sure, of course. And I will say, Tomasz, I did really appreciate the report. Found it highly valuable and interesting. I haven't seen this paper that you provided the link for. I'll check it out. But maybe I'll make one more comment about the bark beetle issue, because it's so important. As soon as you start talking about retention forestry and emulating disturbances, you know, there's an immediate reaction often from the forest management community that might increase bark beetle risks. But I would suggest to you that there's really great science coming out, and of course, many on this call, including Tomasz, are intimately familiar with this, that really help us understand where those risks might be greatest, where those vulnerabilities are highest. So for instance, some of the work that Rupert Seidel's lab, I know you've heard from him in Munich, has been doing, understanding the climate niches where host trees are most susceptible and reproductive success for the bark beetles is highest, and really understanding the spatial distribution of these climate niches on the European landscape. And like those are places where we might say, okay, retention forestry poses risks, but there might be other areas outside those optimal climate niches for bark beetles where this type of approach might be more appropriate. My point here is that I think the science as currently developing will really help us apply some of these more innovative silvicultural approaches.
Then one thing, of course, one always has to ask, because it's also an issue about changing forest management, is the economic dimension. Did you have a look at this? Because this is normally, I mean, if you present this, you know, like to forest owners or industries, then it's always the question about how does this affect our value chains. And while we see clearly that we don't have a segregation approach here in Europe, but a multifunctional approach. But in the end, it's also the economic dimension that's important.
Sure. There are always trade-offs, as you know, always trade-offs between all of these objectives. But you said it, that this fits squarely within the context of multifunctional forestry, you know, where timber revenue may be an objective in wood products, but we're trying to balance that with other services like carbon and hydrology and managing for a range of habitats. So it's all a question of balance, right? Finding opportunities for all of these things on the landscape.
Yeah, and then also about finding new markets for other ecosystem services, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But then another argument could be that more or less, if you sort of minimize the large-scale disturbances, then the economic buffer effect is also strong. I think this is the debate that we currently have. So that's really at the very positive time, as I said. So this is exactly the point where we currently are. So I see Lucia.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation of your work. My question is related to the feasibility of the application of these new silvicultural approaches in the context of Mediterranean forests or forest in semi-arid regions like those of North America. Do you have any experiences on that in your work, or the results are more referred to humid forest? Thank you.
Yeah, that's really an important question. I think we had limited inclusion of Mediterranean forests within our study, particularly drier Mediterranean oak systems. For the purpose of this study, we restricted our analysis to the more mesic, higher precipitation temperate forests of Europe, because when you get into some of the drier oak and other Mediterranean systems, the disturbance regimes are so fundamentally different that we were concerned that we might need an entirely different comparability index to perform the same exercise for those. So I have to say that I think the paper is weak in terms of its relevance to Mediterranean forests. I think that the concepts, though, could absolutely be applied there, and it would be very interesting to replicate this study in the Mediterranean context. I hope that answers your question.
Good, seems so. I think this is, of course, one of the issues that we have with this huge diversity of forest ecosystems across Europe. But I think you covered quite a bit, so this was already quite a good overview. I see one more hand, and I think then we have to move on. Bill, there is also one comment in the chat. Maybe you can do this afterwards in a written form, and then I would give the floor to Eduard, and then we move on with the program, I would say.
Okay.
Good morning, Bill and all, and many thanks for this excellent presentation. It was very suggestive. I think that there are a lot of policy and financial implications in what you're proposing. It's very interesting. And related to the comment of Lucia, I think that it's more a question or a reflection that I see a lot of opportunities in this idea of promoting this silviculture. We could say close to disturbances, not only close to nature.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there is a kind of meeting point there, because being close to nature also means being close to that disturbances that we are not going to avoid in a climate change context.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very powerful, the concept, because also help us to communicate to society that through active forest management, we can prepare better our forest ecosystem landscapes to those disturbances that we are not able to avoid in a context of climate change. And within Mediterranean, it's just a reflection, because you have a lot of work done in USA showing us, the Europeans, how your forest structures, better adapted to the natural fire regimes, are at the same time those forests that are better protecting society from the impact of fire. So on that sense, it's a really crucial aspect from us, from the Mediterranean perspective, the capacity we have to show that doing those adaptation to those disturbances at the same time we are providing in a best way that protection. I don't know if this concept of those forests better adapted to the natural regime, disturbances, etc., are at the same time offering the best protection. Is this concept in USA, you know, in the policy arena, in the social arena, or how you approach this from the academia? Because maybe it's the step we need to, you know, to motivate policymakers, also to motivate funders to promote this kind of, from a avoided cost perspective, because at the end we are avoiding future costs of impact of disturbances. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment and those ideas. There was a lot of rich ideas in what you just said. I'll start with your first point about closer to disturbances. That actually has been a very interesting question with this. I've presented this paper and this concept at many meetings and workshops in Europe, often for foresters, forest practitioners, and I often have the opposite reaction because they don't like the idea of emulating disturbances. You know, in the European context, you've had centuries of practice removing disturbances from the system, deliberately excluding fire and insects. And so the idea that we would want to emulate these things is highly provocative. So the first step is just describing the benefits of this. And why would we want to emulate disturbances? Well, because they provide more complex habitats. They provide habitats for underrepresented biodiversity. They provide a higher degree of carbon storage and carryover. So you have to make these kinds of arguments. And yet, even so, foresters at these meetings often told me, don't call it natural disturbance-based forestry, call it natural dynamic silviculture, which is why we shifted to this. And then the second question you asked had to do with resilience. And I think that, you know, there's still a lot more work to be done on this question. If we use these systems, for example, to diversify the landscape, to break up the continuity of food and host trees for beetles, maybe to reduce susceptibility to wind and to drought, will that produce a more resilient landscape? I think there is some evidence emerging now in Europe that suggests that these practices could be used for that purpose. You asked about the US experience. We do have our own experience with this, mostly in the context of fire in the Western US, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And for us, it's absolutely critical to restore the forest structures and the landscape patterns that natural fire creates, because that's the only way we can reduce the risk of these mega fires. So that's what we're doing. But we also have our own insect examples where I live with, you know, spruce budworm, for example, that has a dynamic very similar to your spruce bark beetle. And we've learned that we have to diversify our landscapes and to make them more complex to limit the spread of spruce budworm in the same way that you're thinking of now with your IPS. So that's how I would answer that question.